Hey, it's Dr. Karen Tang. I'm a board certified gynecologist and minimally invasive surgeon, and recently we've been talking about issues of gender and gender diversity. And recently I did an interview with Schuyler Bailar, who is a trans athlete, activist, and educator and public speaker. And as a former Division I athlete, I know that I had a lot of questions for him about the recent controversies about trans athletes in school competitive sports. So he taught me a lot about what regulations already exist at the level of elite sports, also the statistics on trans athletes, and do they actually have a significant biological advantage, which is what is being said in the news. And then finally, how do we understand this from the perspective of someone who is themselves a trans athlete? So I hope you enjoy.
So I did obviously want to cover the issue about being an athlete, obviously your experiences as a competitive athlete. There's been so much controversy recently about trans women and trans girls competing on high school and college sports.
Okay, so absolutely, trans folks in sports is a huge controversy right now, especially following Biden's declaration to involve gender identity under the Civil Rights, Anti-Discrimination Act, the Equality Act, otherwise known as. There's a number of different ways to go about this, but I think the number one thing I like to start with is that most of these bills, like the anti-trans sports bills, are targeting girls, young girls, right? They're children. This is not about elite sports. This is not about the Olympics. This is not about college sports. This is not even about like national or regional level meets, because at all elite levels, right, you actually have to have all kinds of regulation anyways in order to compete as a trans athlete. What people are focused on, and this is, I probably need to take a step back and set the scene. What people are focused on is when there are, quote, unregulated hormone issues, right? And people are just competing at will. And it's the argument is, and when a man like walks into a women's sport or whatever, or when a boy plays girls sport, right? Those are most of the arguments. And there's a number of things to break down here. There are no boys on a women's team when a trans girl is on a girl's team. There are no men on a women's team when a trans woman is on a women's team. So trans women are women, trans girls are girls. And the number of times I've heard somebody be like, I'm not transphobic, but I still don't think that, men should be on the women's team. And I'm like, if you aren't transphobic, you're not going to call a woman a man. Right. Yeah. So the first thing I always start when we talk about this issue is language. If you're going to actually be in this conversation, you have to call trans women women, and you call trans girls girls. If you like to say that they are trans, great. You can say that they're trans. Let's say they're trans, right? Talk about trans women, talk about cis women. I strongly discourage folks from using the term biological anything, really, because it usually evokes something wrong, inaccurate. And that goes back to our conversation about biological sex and creating it in a binary way that's just false. And it also usually denotes some kind of transphobia, because calling me like a biological female, there's just no need to invoke that, right? You could just say that I was assigned female at birth. If you want to talk about the fact that I have a uterus or talk about something else, you could just say that. You don't have to like gender me as female. The next thing, like I said, is we're focusing on kids. At elite levels, there are already hormone regulations in place in the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, in the International Paralympic Committee, in the NCAA. All of these rules already have hormone regulations. So as a trans person, you have to contend with those in order to compete. So for example, for me as a trans man, I had to take, I took testosterone because I wanted to. And it's very clear like that you don't have to do that if you don't want to. But for me, I decided to take testosterone, and I can't just walk into the men's category and take it. I have to prove that my hormone levels are at an average male level by submitting lab work. And that just makes sure that I'm not doping, and make sure that I'm safe, that my hematocrit levels aren't too high, that my testosterone levels aren't too high, my blood count is okay, like all that kind of stuff, right? And you know better than me about all that kind of stuff. So basically making sure that I'm safe and that I'm not doping. I submit my labs 3 times a season, every season, and that just makes sure of that. Most people don't care at all about trans men in sports. They're like, they either think that we can't compete at all, or that we're cheating because of the testosterone. The cheating because of testosterone is easy to be like, no, I'm literally can give you.
It's like the same level as
right? No way I'm cheating. And then the I suck argument, like, oh, you can't even compete. That would be like, okay, nobody really cares deeply about that. First of all. Second of all, I don't suck. I did just fine. But that's easy for people to get over. Nobody cares. Trans women, on the other hand, people care deeply about. And the number one reason is the whole idea of biological advantage, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing to recognize about that biological advantage, before Tanner stage 2 of puberty, there are no biological advantages. And you probably know that, again, better than me. But before puberty, there are no significant biological differences between boys and girls, or people assigned male at birth, people assigned female at birth, because nothing's happened, right? The only difference is the presence of a penis, and that doesn't make you better or worse at sports.
Right.
So for the most part, before puberty, there's no issue. Before the age of like between 10 and 13, depending on when puberty starts for an individual, there are no differences. And so it does not matter at all what sports team a kid plays for. between the ages of 13 and 18, which is really what people get frightened about, then there starts to be some differences in hormones. Again, for most kids, they're just trying to play sports with their friends on the team. They're trying to kick a soccer ball around. They're trying to run around a track field. They're trying to shoot some hoops. It is not elite sports. And at elite sports, again, there are rules, right? But in just high school sports, wandering around, or club sports with their friends, there's no need to be invasively checking everybody's biology to check whether or not they're quote unquote fair in that way. The problem people miss is that if you were actually to enforce this kind of testing, which is what all these bills are focused on. There's 25 bills in 25 states there are bills right now. They're all mostly accusation-based testing, because either you have to test everyone, which is logistically and financially impossible, or you have to test them based on accusation. Oh, so this person might be trans, let's test them. But in order for accusation-based testing to work, you actually have to accuse somebody, which means there has to be reason for accusing, which means what are the reasons for accusing? Somebody looks too manly, looks too masculine, or somebody's too good. So now, at what point is a girl too good or too masculine to be accused of being trans? And what happens now is you're not only demonizing and weaponizing transness, but you're also policing women's bodies. And so the whole argument of like allowing trans women in sport is going to destroy women's sport. No, excluding them will actually destroy women's sport, or will contribute to the destruction, because you're legally enforcing the policing of women's bodies in sport. And there's so many other factors of this, right? There's also racism and misogyny and white supremacy going on here, because if you look at the people who are being attacked, like the landmark case that started all this, it's two black
black athletes,
being attacked by a white cis girl, right? That's no coincidence. None of us can see that that's a coincidence, right? There's so much white supremacy involved there. So that's sort of an overview. I can dive into any piece of it, but I think it's just so important to recognize that most of the time when people are resistant toward trans girls competing in women's sport or girls' sport, it is not actually a conversation about fairness. It is bigotry masked as I care about fairness.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many things that kind of get tied into this. Like you said, no one is particularly concerned about, trans men competing in sports, because there's sort of this concept of, the misogynistic concept of, like that women are just like inferior to men in sports. So if you have a quote unquote biological male, that just puts every woman at a disadvantage, because automatically they're all going to do more poorly.
Ridiculous idea. Sorry to interrupt you. That
no, it's fine.
Like somebody assigned male at birth is automatically going to be always better.
Always better.
Sports.
Yeah, always.
So false. Like there are so many people assigned male at birth who are not good at sports. Like just having a Y chromosome and having it develop like pseudo normally does not make you immediately good at basketball.
Yeah. The fact that that's always like the narrative is that, well, that just means that they're going to win all the scholarships. And, that there's a sort of an assumption that like you would just then dominate every single, like cis girl at sports. One, that's completely false. And,
so trans girls have been allowed to compete in women's sport for
I was going to ask you to bring that up.
Places, right? So in California and I think like Massachusetts, trans girls have been competing for a while, and no trans girl domination has occurred, right? The IOC has allowed trans girls, I think, for the past 2 Olympics, and 0 trans girls have even been Olympians. But like they haven't even made it into the Olympics. If you look at the statistics, right, of about 1% of the population being trans, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more, right? And you've got thousands of Olympic athletes every year. There should be at least tens of trans women if we were properly represented in sport, but we are not properly represented. So this idea also, this whole trans girl domination destroying women's sport is ridiculous, because we have had trans girls competing in sport for many years now. The NCAA has allowed trans girls to compete for 10 years, actually. And 0 trans girl domination has occurred. And people will point to the like 4 people who have won something, like 4 trans girls who won something, as if that is like, oh, they've dominated. Okay, so there are 4 good trans girls in the entire world that we've seen. So I think it's just it's really baked in transphobia.
Absolutely.
etc. And people just don't see that.
Yeah, I've tried to actually make that, like that specific argument that there are trans athletes, like there are trans girls competing, and like you said, there's no, like dominance. Like it's not that they came in and just like destroyed everyone and destroyed sports, but that is very much the narrative. Like there's sort of like this kind of, like people have whipped up this idea out of fear and transphobia that is not based in reality, and very similar to the bathroom, quote unquote controversy, where people sort of made up this this idea that if you allowed,
Right.
transgender people to use the bathroom of their gender identity, that you were going to have, like women raped and, people are going to be attacked. Obviously, that's not true and has never occurred. And then, like you said, like using the wrong terms, like people saying, well, then men and boys would then compete on girls' teams.
Right.
It's not men and boys. So,
right, exactly. And
yeah.
people, I always find it baffling when people are like, but I'm not transphobic. I support trans people, but men can't play. I'm like, you can't, those are different things. Like you need to, right. And the last thing that I'll add, and I think this is really, really important, is of course there are biological advantages in sport. Sports are built on biological advantages because that's how our bodies work, right? The shortest guy on my swim team at Harvard was 5'6". The tallest guy on my swim team was 6'7". There's a foot and an inch difference, over a foot difference. Is that a biological advantage for that tall guy? Of course.
Of course. Yeah.
Is it unfair? No. Right. And so if people forget about that kind of stuff, also, by the way, that shortest guy was the fastest guy on the team. And was quite good and elected captain his senior year. So like, there's also people who are tall and short can also be good and bad at sports, respectively. So I think we also forget that like height alone doesn't make you a good athlete. Big bones alone don't make you a good athlete. In fact, for some sports, they might do the opposite. And people forget all of this. When a trans woman wants to compete because they suddenly are like, I was going to destroy the factor of blah. And I ask anybody, and especially anybody watching this, to take a step back. If you have parts of you coming up right now as you're listening to this conversation, listen to the emotions, but take a step back and ask yourself where they're coming from. Because likely they're not actually coming from facts. They're coming from things that you've learned in the world about misogyny, about racism. About thinking women are lesser somehow and should be worse at sports, about trans people and what you think about trans people, right? No person is going to choose, this isn't the last argument, sorry, I keep adding things, but no man is going to choose to like assert his dominance by competing on a women's team. Like the other people is like, oh, well, so a man can be like the best in men's sport and then go into women's sport and be the best in a women's sport too. In what world is that going to make somebody feel like more masculine? Like there's no way, because trans men are the most targeted, the most discriminated against, the most marginalized group of people, and they are not held on some pedestal of like, oh, good job, you're a great like person, man, whatever. They're totally like discriminated against. So in what world is that going to help you?
I've definitely said that before too. Like there's sort of this narrative again where people are like, because someone wants to win at sports, they're going to go join a girls' sports team. On no planet would somebody choose to do so. Like you said, there's so much, discrimination and violence against, trans women that there is no way that somebody's like, my decision is going to hinge on me winning this high school sports championship.
No, and also you can't just do that. So at any level, you can't just flip over. You can't be like, oh, today I'm going to be on that team, and today you can't do that because that's not allowed. You have to have at least a certain amount of time for any switch to happen. For the most part, the only switch that you can do quickly is switching from a women's team to a men's team. That you can do quickly, but that's not going to help you win anything, right? Like me, before I took testosterone, shifting from the women's team to the men's team was only a disadvantage. Right? So but if you do switch from a men's team to a women's team, you have to go through one documented year of hormone suppressants at any elite level. So you can't just switch overnight. Also, people are completely ignoring the fact there's so much lack of access to hormone therapy and like gender affirming care for trans folks, especially trans women of color. So they're not able to it's not like an overnight switch. You have so many hoops to jump through to be a trans person, period, to be a Black trans person, to be a Black trans woman in sport. And people completely forget that.
So thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. I hope you learned as much as I did. I really enjoyed it. I know Schuyler gets me to think more deeply about these issues. And so I'm going to link the rest of my interviews with him so you can continue to learn from his wisdom. Please like and subscribe to my channel so we can continue these talks in the future. Have a great day. Bye.